March 6, 1963, 34-year-old Carol Thompson leaned toward the kitchen window of her big brick house on Hillcrest Avenue. In Minnesota, winters were long and cold, and Carol knew the snow she saw falling over the backyard wasn't heavy enough to mean that school would be canceled that day. But before Carol turned her attention back to the counter, where she was getting lunches packed for her 4 kids, she closed her eyes and thought about the trip she'd just taken a few months ago to the Minnesota Museum of American Art. The scene outside reminded her of one of the paintings she'd seen there, and a second later, all Carol wanted was to be back at that museum, not just looking at the painting, but also standing next to the man who had taken her there. Absent-mindedly, Carol began twisting the gold wedding band on her left ring finger. It wasn't her husband, Cotton Thompson, who she'd gone to the museum with. It was a man that Cotton had hired to do some work on the Thompson house more than a year ago. Carol and Cotton just called him by his nickname, Big Red. The tall, handsome, and red-haired door and window salesman had taken an immediate and obvious liking to Carol. And even after the work in the Thompson house was done, Big Red and Carol had kept in touch. Carol's husband, Cotton, who was a criminal defense attorney in downtown St. Paul, was so busy with his law practice that sometimes Carol felt forgotten, and so she had enjoyed Big Red's attention and harmless flirting. So, whenever Big Red was working in the Thompsons' upper-class neighborhood, with all the expensive Tudor-style homes with their gabled windows and exposed timber beams, Big Red would make a point to stop by the house to visit Carol. Big Red would go on strolls in the park with her, and even drove her and the 4 Thompson kids out to the family's summer home on Forest Lake, north of St. Paul. But those visits had stopped a few months ago after Cotton had become furious to find them talking and laughing together in the backyard one afternoon when he came home unexpectedly from work. Now, as Carol stood at the window, she looked down at her hands and saw what she was doing with her wedding band, and she gave herself a mental shake. It was true that Carol had been disappointed when Cotton had told Big Red to stay away from her, but as she reminded herself, Big Red had never posed any real threat to her marriage. In fact, Carol had actually been a bit thrilled to see Cotton's show of jealousy, and she had definitely enjoyed the extra attention Cotton had been paying to her ever since that backyard face-off. Besides, everything that Carol had ever really wanted in life was right here, under the roof of the 2.5-story home that Cotton had redecorated just for her, right down to the custom rugs and the color of the brand new appliances. And best of all, Carol finally had the chance to finish her college degree after 13 years at home raising their 4 kids. Turning to the kitchen counter, Carol took a deep breath, then focused her attention on the familiar tasks that made up her morning routine. With military precision, she laid out the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and fruit for the 3 Thompson girls to take to the local elementary school, and the apple that her 13-year-old son always brought to middle school. Carol had just finished packing the kids' brown bag lunches when she heard the familiar sound of Cotton's footsteps as he came down the stairs. And by the time the farm boy and Navy veteran strolled into the kitchen, Carol was already smiling. And that smile got even wider when her 36-year-old husband didn't stop until he was close enough that Carol could smell his aftershave. As she turned to face Cotton, he gave her a warm kiss on the lips. When Cotton finally stepped away, the connection between husband and wife felt like it was as strong as it had been 14 years ago when Carol had first met Cotton at Macalester College. Carol had been studying Russian literature at the small, prestigious college. Cotton was 2 years ahead of her, and he was finishing his degree in economics. Cotton had an easy charm and could make people laugh, but he also had serious ambition. He wanted to be a respected and financially successful lawyer, and he had the drive to achieve those goals. They married within a year of meeting each other, and by then, Cotton had already decided that this smart, passionate woman who adored books and art was a partner he would love and cherish for the rest of his days. The two wasted no time starting a family. Carol was pregnant just a few months after the wedding. And now, looking at Cotton, Carol thought about how little he had changed. Even though Cotton's hair was still wet from a morning bath, the water hardly even darkened the color. A blonde so white that her husband had been called Cotton ever since he was a boy. Cotton knew that his wife had been annoyed when he had told Big Red that he was no longer welcome at their home. But Cotton was smart enough to know that Carol was an extremely attractive woman with her dark curly hair and easy smile, and all Big Red's interest in Carol had really done was to remind Cotton not to fall into the trap of taking his wife for granted. Cotton wanted to get home from work in time to watch the kids, so Carol could make it to school that evening. Cotton had a late meeting that day that could delay him, but he promised Carol he'd move it if he had to. He hated when she had to miss a class because of him. And also, there was another reason Cotton didn't want to stay late at work tonight. He was nervous to leave Carol home alone. Just a week earlier, everyone in St. Paul had been totally shocked by the murder of a 15-year-old high school student who had been stabbed and beaten to death. Her schoolmate had confessed to the killing just 3 days later, but the sheer brutality of the crime had put everyone in the Thompsons' neighborhood on edge. As Cotton stepped out the door with their son, he told Carol he'd give her a call sometime this morning to check in and let her know when he'd be able to get home that night. They gave each other a final kiss, and then Carol watched Cotton and Jeff disappear into the falling snow. About an hour later, as Carol was vacuuming the upstairs bedrooms, she heard the telephone ring. As she turned off the vacuum and headed downstairs to answer it, she wished that they had a second phone up in their master bedroom. Picking up the receiver in the kitchen, Carol heard Cotton's upbeat voice at the other end of the line. His secretary had apparently changed his schedule, so he would be home in time for Carol to go to her evening class. By the time Carol was off the phone and heading back upstairs to put the vacuum cleaner away, she decided that with a late night ahead of her, maybe she'd just take a break from cleaning and go back to bed. But once Carol was inside the master bedroom, she heard a sound that she didn't recognize coming from somewhere in the house. She held her breath for a second and just listened intently. Carol suddenly missed their little dog, Shotzi, who was a terribly behaved dachshund, whose bad habits included barking at everything that moved. They had just recently gotten rid of him because he chewed up all their carefully redecorated furniture. As Carol strained her ears to hear the sound again, she couldn't hear anything. The house was totally quiet. But Carol was still very much on edge. So when she heard the sound again a minute later, she leapt out of her bed, walked up to the door, and opened it to see what was going on. And when she did, she saw there was someone standing right there. Carol had no time to think. Adrenaline flooding her body, she started to fight for her life. "10 minutes later, just after 9 a.m., 3 houses east of the Thompson house, the bell rang. Ruth Nelson left her breakfast nook to answer the door. But before she got there, the bell rang again. So Ruth hustled the last few steps and opened the door, expecting to chew out a salesman for being so pushy. But instead, she saw a woman standing there, barefoot and dressed only in a blood-soaked blue bathrobe. Blood was streaming from cuts on her scalp and face. It took Ruth a moment to recognize that this was her neighbor and friend, Carol Thompson. Carol, as she looked at Ruth, she grabbed at her throat, and Ruth noticed there was something metal protruding from it. And then, in a hoarse voice, barely above a whisper, Carol begged Ruth for help. Ruth and her husband quickly helped Carol into their home, and Ruth asked Carol over and over again, "Who did this to you?" And Carol just looked at her friend and forced out a few words. She said, quote, "A man came to my house." And then Carol collapsed on the rug. A police officer and a sergeant were just a few blocks away, sitting in their squad car, when they heard the dispatch call at 9:07 a.m. that morning. They arrived at the Nelson home first, where they found the victim, Carol, lying on the floor. Her eyes were open, but she couldn't speak. The doctor who lived across the street had rushed over to help when his wife saw Carol staggering down the street, and the doctor was putting pressure on Carol's most serious wounds. The police officers immediately called for help, and they would discover that the ambulance was actually already on its way. And so just a couple of minutes later, the paramedics arrived, they loaded Carol into the ambulance, and they sped off with her. Meanwhile, Ruth's adult son, who was close to Cotton's age and had known him for years, volunteered to make the difficult call to Cotton's law office. He walked slowly to the phone, took a deep breath, and then dialed. When he got Cotton on the line, he would tell him that his wife had been in some sort of accident and was now being taken to nearby Anchor Hospital. As the sirens of a half a dozen arriving police cars wailed, the 2 police officers who had responded first to the scene went 3 doors down to the Thompsons' house. The first thing they noticed were fresh footprints in the snow covering the brick walkway that ran from the front door to the sidewalk, prints that could have belonged to a family member or perhaps the assailant. The two policemen could also see that the front storm door was closed, but the inner door was open, indicating that the killer, or someone, had left in a hurry. They walked around the footprints, careful not to disturb them, as they peered inside the home. When they saw a puddle of blood on the entryway floor, they decided to wait for those squad cars to arrive before going any further. Within minutes, Detective George Barkley pulled up at the Thompson house, along with several officers of the St. Paul Police Department, where the 50-year-old detective had served for 25 years. Barkley adjusted his fedora hat as he stepped out of the car. The officers on scene told him they found that front door wide open and the side door to the house was unlocked. Detective Barkley knew that if either door had been left unlocked, then that really meant just about anyone could have entered the house and done this. Detective Barkley drew his gun and then led the officers inside the home, being very mindful that the killer could still be in the house. But after searching every room in the house, they discovered that the house was clear. There was no one else there. Barkley headed back upstairs. The kids' bedrooms were undisturbed, but the master bedroom was totally ransacked. Barkley wondered if this was maybe a robbery gone wrong. Maybe a burglar was surprised to find Carol home, and they attacked her. That would explain the chaos inside the house. But there were some things about the crime scene that didn't fit the robbery theory. They didn't really fit any coherent theory at all. As Barkley walked through the house, he just felt more and more confused by the evidence he was seeing. For some reason, the tub in the bathroom was filled with about 6 inches of lukewarm water. There was no indication that Carol had been bathing at the time of the attack. There were also smears of blood on the sink and floor, along with a 14-inch length of thick rubber hose. Clearly, the detective thought, the robber must have brought the hose, but for what reason, he didn't know. In a pool of blood near the bathroom, investigators also found pieces of black and white plastic, the broken handle to a gun. Detective Barkley tracked signs of a struggle which began upstairs and continued downstairs. Carol's fight for her life appeared to have climaxed somewhere between the front entrance to the house and the kitchen. The kitchen was totally smeared with blood, a drawer had been yanked open, and several knives had been pulled out of a tray. The drawer and the linoleum floor were also spotted red. Barkley's men eventually found a pool of blood in the front entrance, and they also found 3 live bullets on the floor. If the robber had a gun, Barkley thought, why had they stabbed Carol so many times instead of just shooting her? And finally, there was the strange question of what, if anything, had actually been stolen. From what Barkley could tell, the house was trashed, but there were pieces of jewelry and other obviously expensive items laying around. At the front entrance, sitting in a pool of blood, they even found a small woman's ring with a cluster of stones in the shape of a heart. And so if this was a robbery, it had been a very unsuccessful one. As Detective Barkley and his team examined the inside of the house, other officers canvassed the neighborhood. For everyone else on the block, it had been a totally normal Wednesday morning, with people beginning their commutes to work and getting their kids off to school. But when police spoke to all the neighbors, nobody had seen anything out of the ordinary. Carol's next-door neighbor had called Carol at 9 a.m., just about the time that Carol was getting attacked. When Carol didn't answer the phone, the neighbor actually peered into her bedroom window to see if she was home, but the neighbor said she didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Whoever attacked Carol had clearly managed to do it without attracting any attention at all, which was hard to do in such a close-knit neighborhood. That suggested to the police that her assailant was not just a crazed person roaming the streets and breaking into homes at random. Whoever assaulted Carol was clearly smart and efficient enough to get away quickly and quietly. As long as they were free, the public could still be in danger. At 10:30 a.m., so an hour and a half after the attack on Carol, the St. Paul Police Department's crime lab team arrived and began dusting for fingerprints, hoping the assailant left his mark. Neighbors peered out of windows, watching the men in overcoats and galoshes standing in the falling snow, taking notes, and snapping photographs. Police also discovered blood droplets and smears tracing Carol's path to various neighbors' houses as she ran around trying to get help. The criminologist followed Carol's footprints out the side door and around the back of her house to the house immediately to the east, and red smears indicated that Carol had rung the bell and pounded on the door and then gone to the next house over before she stumbled to Ruth's house at the corner. Nearby, at Anchor Hospital, where Carol had been taken by the ambulance, her husband, Cotton, sat in the waiting room sobbing while a team of doctors desperately tried to save Carol's life. When Carol had been brought in, she had no pulse. She lost a lot of blood, mainly from the knife wounds in her neck and scalp, and she had lots of cuts on her arms and hands. Carol had clearly fought back hard. There was a 3-inch blade stuck in Carol's throat. The surgeons had removed it, and they performed a procedure called a tracheotomy, which is when doctors cut a hole directly into a person's throat from the outside to help them breathe. But Carol's heart was barely beating, so the doctors put manual pressure on her heart to try to jumpstart it. Doctors also drilled a hole in Carol's skull to remove any blood that might have pooled inside of her head from all the blows she had taken. But ultimately, Carol's injuries proved to be too severe, and at 12:58 p.m. on March 6, 1963, 4 hours after Carol stumbled down her block looking for help, the doctors pronounced her dead. The violent assault had now become a murder investigation for the St. Paul police, and homicides in this Midwestern city were very rare. St. Paul saw an average of just 6 a year. But one of those murders had just taken place 6 days before Carol's, the beating and stabbing of a 15-year-old schoolgirl, only 2 miles from the Thompsons' home. There were some similarities between the two deadly assaults, but Detective Barkley helped put that killer behind bars 3 days before Carol was killed. The schoolgirl killing resolved quickly, but it unsettled the residents of Carol's and Cotton's fashionable Highland Park neighborhood, where there had only been a couple of homicides since the end of World War II, 18 years before, and it put a lot of pressure on Detective Barkley to solve this case fast. At the hospital, Detective Barkley spoke to Carol's grief-stricken husband. Cotton would say that Carol had been in a good mood that morning when he left for work just after 8. He also mentioned calling Carol at 8:30 that morning to tell her he would be able to watch the kids that night so she'd be able to go to school. As a defense attorney, Cotton did understand that the husband would be the number one person of interest at the start of any murder investigation, and he was patient and polite with the barrage of questions from the police. He referred investigators to his secretary, who confirmed that Cotton was indeed at his office at the time of his wife's murder. Cotton would also suggest to Detective Barkley 2 possible theories for this crime. Cotton said that it was possible that one of his former clients might have come to rob him or hurt Carol, but he couldn't think of any actual ex-associates who were disgruntled with him. He offered the police access to his client history, but he said he really didn't think it would lead them to the killer. Then Cotton told the detective his second theory. This one, he said, made much more sense than an angry client. It involved a red-haired window and door salesman that he'd done business with a year earlier. Cotton told detectives that this salesman, named Big Red, developed a clear infatuation with his wife and found every excuse to come to their house to see Carol. Cotton told police that he really didn't like the friendship, quote, that had developed between this man and his wife. Barkley asked Cotton if Carol could have been having an affair with Big Red. Cotton shook his head and said absolutely not. He had seen what was developing between Big Red and his wife, and he had stepped in to put a stop to it before it went any further. Cotton explained that a few months earlier, he had come home unexpectedly in the middle of the afternoon, and he had found Big Red in the backyard talking to his wife, and Cotton had watched them from inside the house, and Big Red had said something that made Carol laugh. Her eyes were sparkling, and then Big Red put a hand on Carol's waist, and at that point, Cotton said he burst out the side door and told Big Red to stay away from his wife and his kids, and they proceeded to get into this big shouting match. Cotton was ready to punch Big Red, but before any fists flew, Big Red ultimately stormed off, and as he left, Big Red vowed that this would not be the last time they saw him. The police would also speak to Carol and Cotton's neighbors on either side of their house to see if they knew anything about this relationship Carol had with Big Red. and the neighbors would say they saw Big Red around, spending time with Carol and the kids, and it just seemed like he was a friend of the family. The neighbors did say, though, that it seemed like Big Red was flirting with Carol, and none could blame him for liking their attractive neighbor. Beneath her horn-rimmed glasses, Carol had this winning smile and quick wit. I mean, she was amazing. And Carol had admitted to her neighbors that she found Big Red very attractive. They both liked art and literature, neither of which held any appeal for Cotton. But Carol swore to whoever she talked to that she and Big Red were just friends. However, whatever the real status of that relationship was, Detective Barkley knew he now had his first good lead. Barkley tracked down Big Red at work that afternoon and drove him to the station. Big Red sat with his head in his hands, sobbing as he answered the detective's questions about his relationship to the Thompson family. He confirmed that he had developed a friendship with Carol after he sold Cotton some windows for their house, and he admitted that after that job was finished, he would swing by to see Carol when he was in the neighborhood. Big Red told police that he had taken Carol to an art museum a couple of times, and once he drove Carol and the kids to their summer home, but he was adamant that he had had nothing to do with Carol's death. He told Barkley that after his backyard altercation with Cotton, he dropped his friendship with Carol altogether. Big Red figured that it would be best for him to stay away. He said he hadn't seen Carol since the dust-up with Cotton, and at 9 a.m. on March 6th, when Carol was attacked, Big Red said he was at a sales conference, which his boss would back up. And so, this case was clearly not going to wrap up as fast as Detective Barkley hoped, and the police department was really starting to feel the heat. News of Carol's murder sent shockwaves through the Highland Park and larger Twin Cities communities. A home invasion in that exclusive neighborhood was unthinkable, and the victim, an all-American housewife and mother of 4, was well known in the community and universally adored. To imagine such a woman meeting such a brutal end shook people to the core, and the killer, whoever they were, was still out there. Nervous housewives peered out of their windows, refusing to answer the door for deliveries or door-to-door salesmen, and husbands began coming home early from work every night. In a town that rarely saw a locked door, chain locks were now flying off the shelves of hardware stores. Sporting goods stores ran out of shotgun shells and pistols and bullets. Public officials demanded results. In response, across the Twin Cities region, police rounded up anyone who could in any way be considered a suspect. Wives turned in abusive husbands, petty thieves and sex offenders were pulled off the street, police hauled in peeping toms, public drunks, and known burglars. They threw homeless men, even the disabled and mentally ill, into squad cars and took them downtown. Anyone that seemed even a little bit different or, quote, suspicious in any way, the police fingerprinted and interrogated. But none seemed connected to the case. As the month of March 1963 ticked away, Detective Barkley was starting to get frustrated. He had no fingerprints and no eyewitnesses. His victim had problems in her marriage, but both her husband and the other man she had gotten close to had very solid alibis. The crime scene looked like a robbery, except nothing had been stolen. The only good evidence he really had was the black and white pieces of plastic laminate that police had found in the entryway of the home and in the upstairs hallway. They were very likely parts of the handle of some kind of gun. Detective Barkley figured if he could just identify the weapon, maybe it could lead him to his killer. So he sent the pieces of plastic off to the FBI for analysis, and then he waited very impatiently for a few weeks, and then finally he got his answer. The plastic pieces were indeed from the grip of a gun. They were from a custom-made pistol grip for a 7.65mm Luger pistol. Detective Barkley felt relief at finally making progress here, and now he was hopeful that this would lead to the break in the case that he so badly needed. And so, on April 5th, 1 month after the murder, Detective Barkley and the St. Paul police chief held a televised press conference. They affixed those customized pieces of the pistol grip onto an identical Luger and displayed images of it in poster-sized photos. Barkley and the police chief blasted these pictures all over the state in hopes that someone would recognize this custom gun and call the police to tell them who it belonged to. In the days following the press conference, Barkley began combing through the numerous tips he had from the public since the murder. and at some point he found an unnamed source claiming that Cotton had taken out $900,000 in life insurance on his wife across 3 carriers, and some of those policies were apparently written as recently as 2 months before the murder. Barkley looked into this claim, and he soon discovered that Cotton had indeed taken out policies, but with 8 carriers totaling $1.1 million, about $10 million in today's dollars. At this time, the average American was making less than $10,000 a year. Investigators spoke to Carol's parents. Her father, who was a successful heating and plumbing contractor in St. Paul, valued his own estate at about $600,000, which would be about $6 million today. Carol, being an only child, was set to inherit all of that money, meaning if she were to die, the family fortune was set to go to her and Cotton and the kids. Detective Barkley started wondering if this, quote, pillar of the community, aka Cotton, was not really the man he presented himself to be. As his investigators spoke to more people in the Thompson circle of friends, he learned that Cotton was often seen around town with other women. Cotton started to look really suspicious to Barkley. But being a bad husband and buying life insurance was not illegal, and Barkley could find no connection between Cotton and the murder weapon. But before Barkley got too deep into his re-examination of Cotton, his press conference about the Luger totally paid off. On April 9th, he received a call from someone claiming that the Luger was actually his. A traveling salesman from Minneapolis told police that his apartment had been burglarized on February 14th, 3 weeks before Carol's murder, and one of the items he reported stolen was that pistol. He had made the customized hand grip in a shop class at a local community college. Detective Barkley confirmed that the salesman was nowhere near St. Paul the day of Carol's murder, and so could not have been her killer. Finally, this felt to Barkley like a really solid lead backed by evidence, but it presented a whole new set of challenges. Now Barkley had to solve a burglary in another city in the hopes that the perpetrator of that crime was also the one who committed this murder. But it wouldn't take long for the police to catch another break. On April 17th, so 8 days after that salesman called to say that Luger was his, 2 masked men burst into a bar in St. Paul, they drew their guns, and demanded the bartender hand over the cash in his till. Then one of the robbers punched the bartender before taking the money and escaping with his accomplice. A few days later, St. Paul police arrested the 2 men on suspicion of burglary and assault. The tavern robbery was the latest of several robberies they had committed in the area. When police got the thieves into interview rooms in the jail, one of the robbers struck a deal with the county and started talking. He had information the police wanted. He knew all about that special Luger the cops were looking for. He and his buddy were the ones who actually stole it. The robber claimed that he had only had the Luger for a month. He told police that 2 weeks before Carol's murder, he had given the gun to a man that he and his accomplice knew. His name was Norman Mastrian. The cops knew Norman too. He was a former champion boxer whose life had gone totally south, and he'd had lots of scrapes with the law. In fact, he was actually a suspect in another murder, but detectives couldn't find enough evidence to charge him. Detective Barkley thought Norman was certainly capable of killing Carol, but the robber told police that Norman was not the last person he had seen with that Luger. The day before Carol got murdered, the robber watched Norman give it to someone else, a guy named Dick W.C. Anderson. And police did some digging, and they discovered that Dick was a Korean War veteran with a Purple Heart. And to get a Purple Heart, it means you got injured in combat. But Dick also had a drinking problem, and he had been through a bitter divorce, and he was now apparently a petty criminal, but it really didn't seem like he was a murderer. And Dick had absolutely no connections to the Thompsons, so why would he kill Carol? It felt like the more clues Detective Barkley and his team found, the more of a mystery this case became. Detective Barkley had no problem finding Norman Mastrian, the former champion boxer, but Dick Anderson, the last one to have the Luger, was another story. Dick had left town in a hurry after seeing Barkley's press conference about the Luger. Detective Barkley put out an all-points bulletin across the country with a description of Dick. It was a long shot, but on May 19th, it paid off. 1,700 miles from St. Paul, police in Phoenix, Arizona entered a cheap motel on an unrelated matter, and they recognized the man who was checking out at the time as Dick Anderson. Police immediately extradited Dick back to Minnesota, and after 3 days in jail, Dick Anderson would confess to everything. And suddenly, all the loose ends and confusing, conflicting pieces of evidence made a terrible kind of sense. The story that Dick had to tell was far more shocking than anything Detective Barkley or any of his colleagues had imagined. Here's what really happened on March 6, 1963, the day Carol Thompson was murdered. Before dawn, Dick Anderson slipped into the Thompson house through the unlocked side door while everyone in the house was asleep. Dick moved silently through the kitchen and headed down to the basement where he waited in the dark. Now, what Dick was doing was not his typical line of work. However, he was broke, and the $3,000 that Norman Mastrian had offered him to do what he was going to do was a lot of money, and so he had agreed to do it. So Dick waited in the darkness of a stranger's basement, periodically glancing at the hand-drawn map he had been given of the home's layout. Dick had also fortified his courage with vodka and amphetamines, and so his heart was racing. The sun rose and Dick listened as just a few feet above his head in the kitchen, Carol got her family fed and out the door. About 20 minutes later, Carol answered the telephone. It was Cotton calling from the office, telling her he'd be home in time for Carol to go to class that evening. Meanwhile, in the basement, Dick grasped the 14-inch length of thick rubber tubing Norman had given him. Dick's plan was to slip into the kitchen and strike Carol on the back of the head with this rubber. He thought a clean blow would totally knock her out. Dick could hear Carol's voice, muffled through the floorboards, as she spoke to her husband. Dick carefully headed up the stairs until one of the wooden steps let out a loud squeak. He heard Carol's voice stop cold. Dick froze and waited to hear Carol resume her phone call. He realized that Carol would hear him coming if he continued up the stairs, so he revised his plan. He would wait in the basement until he was sure Carol had left the kitchen. Eventually, Dick would hear Carol vacuuming on the second floor for several minutes, and then right as he was about to go up, he heard the phone ring again. But this time, Carol did not come downstairs to answer it. She stayed upstairs and let it ring. And so at this point, Dick made his move. He ascended the last few basement steps, he padded through the empty kitchen and climbed the main stairs to the second floor. And as he did this, Carol heard him, and she walked to her bedroom door right as he arrived in front of her bedroom door. And when Carol opened it up, she was totally startled to see this man she had never seen before standing in her house. But before she could scream, Dick told Carol that he was just here to rob her. He promised that if she did what she was told, she would get through this just fine. And so Carol did as she was told, and she laid down face first on the floor, at which point Dick struck her in the back of the head with that thick rubber hose, knocking her out. He then dragged Carol's unconscious body down the second floor landing, leaving her in front of the bathroom door for a moment. Then Dick looked into the bathroom, and he saw water in the bathtub, just as Norman had told him to expect. But as Dick began dragging Carol into the bathroom, Carol woke up, and immediately she began fighting back. Dick, in a panic, pulled out the Luger to shoot her, but the pistol wouldn't fire, and so he just began bashing the pistol into Carol's face. Blood flowed from Carol's forehead, but she just kept on fighting. Dick hit her again and again, hard enough to break off a piece of the gun's white and black plastic laminate grip. Carol eventually managed to separate herself from her attacker, and she scrambled down the stairs, tumbling into the entryway, and she tried to escape out the front door. But Dick caught up to her right as she was struggling to open up the chain latch, and he continued to bludgeon her over and over again with his now broken gun. Another piece of the handle would break off during this beating downstairs, and 3 live rounds would pop out of the gun. At this point, Dick was totally panicking, and he left Carol on the floor moaning in pain, and he ran into the kitchen. There, he rifled through a door and grabbed a 3-inch paring knife to finish Carol off. Dick descended on Carol in the hallway between the kitchen and front entrance and began stabbing her over and over. On the 50th blow, the knife got stuck in Carol's throat, and when Dick tried to pull it out again, the blade snapped off the handle. At this point, Carol finally stopped moving, and Dick climbed off her, marveling at her will to live. But now it was over, and Dick had things to do before getting out of there as fast as he could. Upstairs in the bathroom, Dick turned on the sink and washed the blood off his shaking hands. He then rushed into the neatly kept master bedroom, pulling out drawers, knocking things over to make it look like this was a robbery gone bad. As Dick bounded down the stairs, he didn't notice that Carol was no longer where he had left her, in the short hallway that led to the kitchen. Dick had no clue that as he was heading out the front door, Carol was stumbling down the block looking for help. Dick left the Highland Park neighborhood and connected with Norman. Nothing in their plan had gone as expected. What was supposed to be a bloodless killing had turned into a gory and violent mess. Together, they disposed of the gun in a swampland north of St. Paul, and then when Norman returned to his home, he picked up the phone to make the hardest call of all. At the other end of the line was the man who had plotted Carol's death from the start and actually put up the money to make it happen. This was the one person Carol had loved and trusted since she first met him 14 years ago at Macalester College. It was Carol's husband, Eugene Cotton Thompson, and he had been planning his wife's murder for almost 2 years. Cotton had been in an on-again, off-again affair for 3 years with a woman named Jackie Olson. He met Jackie when he represented her in a divorce. Cotton handled divorces as well as criminal cases. The attractive young mother didn't have the money to pay him, so Cotton got her a job as a stenographer so she could work it off. She'd go to, quote, business dinners with Cotton and out-of-town trips, while Carol stayed home with the kids. Cotton enjoyed his illicit romance, but Jackie wanted to build a life with him. When Cotton balked at leaving Carol and his kids, Jackie said fine, and she married another man. But when Jackie's new relationship hit the rocks fast, Cotton made another play for her. He promised Jackie that they wouldn't have to worry about Carol anymore, and they'd have plenty of money to live on for the rest of their lives. One of the clients that Cotton represented as a defense attorney was an old classmate from Macalester who had had several scrapes with the law, including being roped into an unrelated murder. This person was Norman Mastrian, and Norman didn't have to plan anything. Cotton had that all figured out. A month before the murder, Cotton got rid of the family dog who barked whenever anything came into the house. Cotton had removed the upstairs phone 2 days before the murder, telling Carol he would swap it out for a phone that fit the house's new color scheme. He planned to call Carol on the morning of the murder, which would ensure that she would go into the kitchen, where the only phone left in the house was located. It was here that Cotton planned for Norman to strike her with the rubber hose and knock her out, and then Norman was supposed to carry an unconscious Carol up the stairs to the bathroom where there would be water left in the tub. Cotton did not typically bathe before work, but on the day of the murder, he would. And he'd leave the stopper in the drain so Norman could fill Carol's lungs with the water. Cotton figured they could make it look like Carol slipped in the tub, hit her head, and then drowned in the bathwater. Knowing that the police would be looking at Cotton as their first suspect, he had had an airtight alibi. He'd be at work making phone calls with his secretary. Cotton planned to finger Big Red for the murder. But Cotton's plan unraveled in a few key places. First, Norman Mastrian, despite whatever crimes he had committed up to that point, he couldn't bring himself to actually kill a church-going mother of 4. So he had subcontracted out the actual killing and did not tell Cotton. Norman gave Dick Anderson the same marching orders Cotton had given him. But Dick wanted more than just a piece of rubber tubing with him when he entered the Thompson house, and so he asked Norman for a backup weapon in the form of a gun. Norman then turned to his 2 robber friends who gave him the customized Luger pistol they'd recently stolen when they burglarized an apartment, and Norman gave it to Dick. Cotton could never have anticipated that pieces of a gun he never planned on using during this attack would then lead police to the hitman, who would then confess everything he knew. police arrested Cotton on June 20th, 1963, 2 months after Carol's murder. In November of 1963, just 8 months after the murder, a jury found Cotton Thompson guilty, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison. As for Norman Mastrian, the middleman for the hit, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison, all of which he served, and as for Dick Anderson, the man who actually killed Carol, he would spend almost 2 decades behind bars. On the evening of January 13th, 2002, a 42-year-old man named Ronald Huff walked in the door of his studio apartment in the city of Newark, Delaware. He had just come back from visiting his grandmother, and now he was feeling really sick. Inside of his apartment, it was blazing hot, but that was by design. That's how he kept the temperature. Ronald took off his coat and threw it over one of the many handmade wooden cages that were strewn about his living room. Then he dragged himself over to his house phone, picked it up, and he called the auto dealership where he worked. When the office manager answered, Ronald told her that he would not be able to come into work the following day because he was feeling so unwell. He hung up the phone and then leaned on the counter for a second, feeling lightheaded. Then suddenly, from behind him, he heard a hiss. Right away, Ronald turned around and walked over to his fridge, and instinctively, he reached out his right hand to open the door. But as soon as he grabbed the handle and squeezed, he felt a shot of pain in his right hand. He had forgotten that his right hand was all bandaged up because it was injured. And so grimacing, Ronald reached out with his left hand and he opened up the fridge that way. Then, after shutting the fridge, he walked over to the kitchen counter and he reached into a jar and he pulled out a whole fistful of live cockroaches. They were about 2 inches long each and they wriggled around inside of his hand. He threw the cockroaches onto the ground and then watched as they scattered. Now that Ronald's chores were finished, he decided he would just go lay down, because again, he's feeling horrible. But as he walked across the kitchen towards his bedroom, that dizziness he was feeling earlier came back, and suddenly it was like the whole world was spinning around him and he could barely stay on his feet. He kept trying to walk towards his bedroom, but he just couldn't do it, and eventually he stumbled and began to fall. Ronald lurched sideways and blindly stumbled to the right, trying to catch himself, and the first thing he touched with his outstretched arm was the door to his apartment. And so he grabbed it and he tried to stay on his feet, but he couldn't, and so he turned his body around and pressed his back up against the door to steady himself. But he was just so woozy and weak that eventually he just kind of slouched down to the ground, back against the door, feet out in front of him. Slowly, he let his eyes close. As Ronald passed out, all he could hear were the sounds of roaches scurrying and chicken bones crunching. Three days later, Ronald's neighbor heard the crackle of police walkie-talkies out in the hallway. He opened his door and he saw 2 police officers and the superintendent of their building standing in front of Ronald's door. So this neighbor liked Ronald and knew him to be a nice, quiet guy, and so he couldn't imagine why police would be at his door. But then he thought about it, and he actually hadn't seen Ronald in several days. The neighbor watched as the police officers knocked on Ronald's door, waiting for Ronald to come out, but the door never opened. And after a few minutes of knocking, the police finally stepped back from the door and gestured for the superintendent to step forward and use his key to open the door. And then after the superintendent had done that, the neighbor watched as the police officers tried to open the door, but couldn't. It was like there was something really heavy blocking the door from opening. Finally, both police officers leaned hard enough on the door that they got it to open up just a little bit. The neighbor watched as the officers stuck their heads into the apartment and then jumped back with their hands on their guns. Then one of the cops grabbed their radio and began frantically talking into it, and then the neighbor watched as the officers and the superintendent quickly walked down the hallway out of sight, leaving Ronald's apartment door partially open. And as the neighbor heard the sound of sirens wailing outside, he took a cautious step into the hallway and realized he could actually see into Ronald's apartment through the open door. And what he saw inside of there was so horrifying that for a second, the neighbor just froze. And then a second later, he backed into his own apartment and slammed the door behind him. Hours later, this neighbor could not get the image of what he had seen in Ronald's apartment out of his head. So he grabbed a piece of paper and just began sketching the bizarre scene. It would turn out Ronald had a secret. And on the evening of January 13th, 2002, right after Ronald had called in sick to his work, that secret killed him. On the floor is Ronald's dead body. His face, his ears, his hands, and his internal organs had all been eaten. And surrounding Ronald were the giant monitor lizards that he was secretly keeping as pets. He had 7 of them, which he fed roaches and raw chicken and allowed to just free roam his apartment. They ranged in size from 2 feet to 6 feet long. These are massive lizards. And unfortunately for Ronald, not only are monitor lizards carnivores, but also their mouths are filled with deadly bacteria. The reason Ronald's hand was bandaged up, his right hand, is because one of his lizards a week prior to his death had bit his hand, and the bacteria had given him this horrible staph infection. And it was that staph infection a week later that very likely caused him to pass out inside of his apartment. And then after that, he was eaten by the lizards. Now, it's assumed he died from the staph infection and then was consumed. However, the autopsy couldn't prove that. And so it is possible he may have been still alive when they began to eat him. After Robert's death, his lizards were taken from his apartment and placed in the Catoctin Wildlife Preserve and Zoo in Thurmont, Maryland. Our next story is called Modern Day Dinosaurs. Off the coast of mainland Southeast Asia in the Indian and Pacific Oceans lies Indonesia, which is the world's largest archipelago. It's made up of 17,508 individual islands that, if you were measuring from the westernmost point on the westernmost island to the easternmost point on the easternmost island, it would be 5,000 kilometers right across the equator. So it spans 1/8 of the world's circumference. Many of these islands are tiny, uninhabited, and unremarkable. At first glance, you might think that about one particular island that's located 2,500 kilometers north of Australia. And I would tell you the name of this island, but if I did, I would be giving away the island's secret. Living on this island are 2,000 people who are direct descendants of former convicts who were exiled to this island. And they share this island with a particular predator that is endemic to this island, who is a direct descendant of flesh-eating dinosaurs. It can grow up to 10 feet long and weigh up to 350 pounds, and its taste buds are so immaculately developed, it can taste blood in the air up to 9 kilometers away. These creatures are so good at smelling blood and death that anytime there is a burial on this island, they have to put big boulders over the gravesite. Otherwise, these creatures will come running out of the jungle and dig up the freshly deceased and eat them. This creature's bite is savage, and they certainly have the ability to rip a person in two, and in the past they have, but they don't typically bite to kill. They bite to create a massive flesh wound so they can inject venom into the wound site. This allows them to not expend a ton of energy waiting for their prey to die so they can eat it. They basically bite you, poison you, leave, come back within 24 hours, and then they eat you. These creatures are strict carnivores and have a voracious appetite where they will eat up to 80% of their own body weight in a single day. They've been known to bite goats and eat them whole by opening up their mouth and ramming the body of the goat into a tree to force it down their throats. But when goats and sheep and buffalo are not enough to feed their appetite, they start eating each other. In fact, cannibalism is so common that their young will hide in the trees for the first 4 years of their life, hiding from their own parents. Because if they're spotted by an adult, they'll be eaten. On top of all this, they can climb, run, and swim faster than a human can. These apex predators are called Komodo dragons, and they live on this one island in Indonesia called Komodo Island. In 2009, a 31-year-old fisherman named Mohammed Anwar, who had grown up on Komodo Island and was living there at the time, decided he wanted some fruit. He normally would just eat the apples that were right outside of his house, but he had always been tantalized by the sugar apple trees that were inside of the fenced-off section of Komodo Island, the so-called forbidden section. This section was, of course, teeming with Komodo dragons, and so as a result, the locals basically fenced it off and said, we don't go over there, they don't come over here. But Mohammed had always wanted those sugar apples. He'd grown up here, and he never got to have one. And so this day, for whatever reason, he decided, today's the day I'm going to get one. And so he goes over to the fence and he's looking out, and there's some fairly tall grass, so he can't see what's on the immediate other side of this fence, but it's pretty open. Then he can see the trees, they're a little bit off in the distance. And so after looking around and feeling like the coast was clear, he hopped the fence and he ran out to the sugar apple tree. Mohammed's neighbor, Teresa Tawa, was outside and happened to look over at Mohammed right as he hopped the fence into the forbidden section. And so she ran over to the fence and yelled to him to come back, but he didn't hear her. And so she's standing at the fence looking out, scanning herself to see if there's any Komodo dragons out there, and she didn't see any. And so she turns her attention to Mohammed, and she's watching him, hoping that he just gets the apples and comes back without incident. And as she's watching, she sees he's reaching out and extending his arm just far enough. He wants to get one more apple, and he loses his footing and he falls to the ground. From her perspective, she couldn't see Mohammed on the ground because the tall grass obscured him. So she didn't know if he's laying there unconscious or if he's just rolling around and he's in pain and he's about to stand up. And so she's just looking anxiously, hoping he stands up soon. And then she hears the sound of two Komodo dragons running through the tall grass. She can see the grass moving as these two massive creatures are running and grunting at full speed towards Mohammed. Mohammed, when he fell, he had cut himself, and they smelled his blood and they charged over, and Teresa could only scream and yell for help as these two Komodo dragons ate Mohammed. The authorities were able to get out there pretty quickly, and they were able to get the Komodo dragons off before they actually consumed him, but he was already dead. Today, you can actually go to Komodo Island as a tourist, but it costs you $1,000 to get a membership fee, and then once you get there, you're only allowed to be in a couple different sections that are totally regulated, and you're really not anywhere near the Komodo dragons because it really is extremely dangerous. The next and final story of today's episode is called Cat and Mouse. On the afternoon of December 6th, 1997, a man named Yuri Trush drew his rifle and crept silently through a remote forest in eastern Russia as he and his team of 3 other armed men and his dog followed this trail of pink snow. All of the men and the dog were on very high alert because they knew someone or something was out in these woods watching them. After walking for a while, Yuri and his crew spotted a small cabin up ahead in this clearing. This cabin, they knew, belonged to a guy named Vladimir Markov, who was a hunter who had gone missing recently, and that was actually why Yuri and his crew were out here. They were searching for Vladimir. But as Yuri and his crew got closer to this cabin, Yuri couldn't help but feel really terrified. Yuri was a 47-year-old big-time weightlifter and ex-military guy who was also a seasoned hunter. I mean, this is a tough, strong guy, but as he walked up on Vladimir's cabin, it was super obvious that something horrible and violent had happened here. All around the scene was pieces of broken furniture. There was a ceramic sink that was shattered outside and the pieces were everywhere. There was a bunch of beehive boxes that had been badly damaged. There was the shed that clearly had been ripped to pieces. And also all over the area outside of this cabin was blood. And this pink trail of snow, this blood trail they were following, led right up to the front door of this cabin, where there was also a big streak of blood on the front door. Now, even though Yuri was scared to go any further, he knew he was in charge and he had to go and look inside that cabin to see if maybe Vladimir was there. And so Yuri walked into the bloody clearing, he made his way up to the front door of the cabin, and with his crew right behind him on the porch, he used his rifle and pushed the door inward. Now at first, Yuri didn't see anything inside the cabin because his eyes hadn't adjusted and there were no windows, so no light was coming into the cabin. But after a second of Yuri kind of standing in the doorway with his rifle to make sure there was no threat inside the cabin, his eyes adjusted and he realized Vladimir was not in there, and in fact, the cabin looked abandoned. So Yuri stepped inside and he looked around and immediately he noticed all the walls inside this cabin were covered in these deep gouges and scratches. And then he looked on the ground and he found more wrecked furniture and lots more blood. But in a weird way, this actually gave Yuri some hope that maybe Vladimir was alive. He might be badly hurt, but if he's not here, he must be somewhere. And so Yuri turned around and he walked out of the cabin, and right as he stepped onto the snow with his men and his dog right behind him, 3 things happened practically all at once. The first thing was Yuri's dog began whining uncontrollably and running in circles. And number 2, there were all these crows in the trees nearby that just all at once suddenly flew into the sky and disappeared. And the third thing was this unbelievably loud growling sound that seemed to be coming from somewhere really far away and also somewhere really close. It was like the forest itself was growling. 5 days earlier, on December 1st, the soon-to-be missing hunter, Vladimir Markov, decided to give up on another unsuccessful hunt, and he slung his rifle over his shoulders and he lit a cigarette under his big bushy mustache, and he and his 3 dogs turned around and began the slow walk back to their small cabin in the middle of the woods. Vladimir was really frustrated because he'd been staying in this cabin in the woods, away from his wife, away from his family, to try to hunt some game and bring some meat back, but so far, he hadn't caught anything. But as his 3 dogs kind of rounded a corner in this forest, he spotted something up ahead that was like an answer to his prayers. He saw there was a dead boar just lying out in the middle of the forest, and it was in this big pool of blood, and there was still steam coming off of the body, which meant this was a fresh kill. And so Vladimir raised his rifle in case whatever had killed this animal was nearby, but when he didn't see anything, he just went with his dogs over to the carcass, and he pulled out a hatchet, and he cut off 2 big haunches of meat from this boar. Now, Vladimir knew it was totally in bad form to steal another potential hunter's kill, although he didn't know if a hunter had killed this boar or if another animal had killed this boar, but he still felt bad about what he was doing. However, Vladimir was desperate. He didn't have any meat, and here it was, so he took the opportunity. After Vladimir had wrapped up this meat and put it in his bag, he and his 3 dogs jogged the last few miles back to the cabin, and when they got there, it was basically pitch black outside. Now, Vladimir was not scared of the forest at night, but he knew there were predators out here at night, so he needed to act quickly. So he rushed over to his small shed that was right outside of his cabin, and he put the boar meat inside, shut the door, and locked it, and then he turned to go into his cabin to retire for the night. But after taking only a couple of steps towards his cabin, he realized his 3 dogs had not followed him. And so he turned around and he saw the 3 dogs were totally on edge, looking out beyond the shed where he had just put the meat. They were kind of looking out into the dark forest. Now remember, he's all alone in the middle of the woods here. It's nighttime, there's no visibility. And so Vladimir grabbed his flashlight and he shined it kind of roughly in the direction that the dogs were looking, like they had seen something. And he's shining his light, but all he sees are just dark trees and nothingness. There was nothing there. Vladimir did his best not to panic, but he couldn't help but feel like there was a predator nearby and his dogs had picked up on it, and so he just wanted to get inside the cabin and shut and lock the door as quickly as possible. And so he began backing up towards the door of his cabin while calling his dogs towards him, and 2 of the dogs followed. But a 3rd dog just stayed where she was and continued to kind of whine and growl and look out away from the cabin in this direction that all the dogs were looking. But eventually, this dog just took off running into the forest. Vladimir, who loved his dogs, screamed and screamed for this dog to come back, but the dog didn't. And so Vladimir just stood there with his 2 dogs in front of his cabin door, listening to the bark of this 3rd dog getting farther and farther away into the woods. And then suddenly, Vladimir heard his dog start to whimper. And then it was like the forest erupted with the loudest growl he had ever heard in his life. And then there was silence. Vladimir was horrified and just instinctively grabbed the 2 other dogs and stumbled into his cabin and shut and locked the door behind him. Now, Vladimir adored his 3 dogs. Those were his closest friends in the world, and all he wanted to do was run out there and save that 3rd dog. But just based on how loud that growl was, he knew whatever was out there would kill him. And so this was a suicide mission if he went out there, and so he decided he would just stay put with the 2 dogs, and he just hoped that his 3rd dog somehow survived its encounter with whatever was out there. But after sitting in his cabin for only a couple of minutes kind of consoling his 2 other dogs, Vladimir heard more activity outside of his cabin. He heard what sounded like wood splintering and breaking. Now, there were no windows in Vladimir's cabin. However, he had drilled a couple of holes, very small holes, in each of the walls of the cabin so he could look out and use them as hunting blinds. And so Vladimir ran to the hole that looked out the front of his cabin towards where his shed was and where this wood breaking sound was coming from. And when he looked out through this hole, remember, it's the middle of the night, there's no lights outside, so he couldn't really see anything. But even in the darkness, when he looked kind of roughly in the direction of the shed where the boar meat was, he could clearly see this huge, shadowy creature moving around really violently, like its body was jerking in different directions. And it was obvious to Vlad that whatever this creature was, it was ripping his shed to pieces, breaking all the wood apart, probably to get in and get the boar meat. And that's when it dawned on Vladimir that whatever this creature was, it very likely was the creature that killed the boar that he stole, and now this creature was back to reclaim its meat. And so as Vladimir realized that, he just hoped that whatever this creature was, once it had its boar meat back, that it would just leave and not come after him. However, after this creature had totally decimated the shed, and so by default had clearly reached the boar meat inside, the creature didn't leave. It just sat down and stared in the direction of Vladimir and the cabin. And for several hours, Vladimir just continued to stare out this hunting blind hole at this shadow creature that was not moving. And after a while, Vladimir got tired. The creature wasn't moving, it's the middle of the night, he'd been really busy all day. And so at some point, Vladimir and his two dogs kind of dozed off. And when they woke up a couple hours later, when it was still dark outside, Vladimir looked out the hole again, and he saw the creature was actually now gone. For a second, Vladimir was relieved. He's thinking, great, this thing's gone, I'm safe now. But just to make sure, he wanted to go to the other holes he had drilled in the walls of his cabin to look out in all four directions and make sure this creature really was gone. So he stood up and he walked over to one side, he looked out that hole, and all he saw was dark forest, nothing there. He walked to the other side of the cabin to another one of these holes, he looked out it, and again, just dark forest, no creature. Then he goes to the back of his cabin and looks out that hole, and this time, again, he does see just dark forest, but then suddenly something slammed into the wall that he's looking through, and then just as suddenly as this huge collision has happened, as Vladimir is kind of still looking out the hole, this massive yellow eye suddenly lowers down and looks right back through the hole right at Vladimir. It was the shadowy creature that had broken into the shed, and it had never left. And this creature, after quickly looking at Vladimir through the hole, it backed up a little bit, exposing its entire face to Vladimir. And Vladimir, who's so scared he can't move, he's just looking out the hole the whole time, he sees this enormous face with all this fur that's covered in blood. It's got these enormous teeth and its mouth is open and it's staring right at him like it wants to jump on him and kill him. And then this creature winds up and swipes at the hole and literally rips a bunch of wood off the side of the cabin. And reflexively, Vladimir just grabs his rifle, raises it, and fires a shot through the hole at this creature. And the creature whimpers, turns around, and runs off. Vladimir would stay up the rest of the night, anxiously looking through each of the holes around his cabin, just anticipating this horrible thing to come right back and try to attack him again. But eventually the sun came up and the creature did not come back. And so Vladimir was thinking, okay, now I'm safe. I can go outside and kind of figure out what's happened here and figure out my next move. And so Vladimir grabbed his dogs. He went to his door. He opened it up. He stepped outside and looked around. He didn't see anything. As a precaution, he fired his rifle into the air to scare off any animals that could be nearby. And when clearly, the creature wasn't here, there's nothing here, he's all alone, he stepped down onto the snow and he noticed these huge prints in the snow, which had to be from this shadowy creature that had tried to attack him. But now that it was daylight, Vladimir can look at these prints up close and he knew what kind of creature this was. This was a Siberian tiger, and this was an enormous Siberian tiger. But that was not the most terrifying part of this discovery. Instead, it was what Vladimir saw these prints doing. These prints circled around the cabin over and over and over again. which meant the night before, after Vladimir fell asleep, this tiger had come up and basically begun stalking him and his 2 dogs. It must have known they were in the cabin. And then at some point, maybe the tiger saw Vladimir's eye inside of that little hole he was looking through, and the tiger tried to pounce. But Vladimir's thinking to himself, something's wrong with this Siberian tiger. While Siberian tigers are certainly dangerous to people, they are not known for actively hunting people. That's not something they do. But based on these prints, and just generally based on what Vladimir saw the night before, it seemed very likely that this Siberian tiger was actively stalking Vladimir. But even though Vladimir was totally terrified by this point, the only thought really going through his mind at this point was going out and trying to find his missing 3rd dog. He knew the chances of his dog still being alive were slim, but he had to go look. However, he knew he would need backup in case he ran into this Siberian tiger. So Vladimir put his 2 dogs on leashes, and then with them in hand, he began running towards his neighbor's house. It would take Vladimir and his dogs about 1 hour to run the 4 miles to his neighbor's cabin, and when he got there, he knocked, and his neighbor, whose name was Ivan, he opened the door, and Vladimir practically ran Ivan over, just trying to get inside of his cabin to safety. And then once Vladimir was inside, and Ivan had shut the door, and he's looking at Vladimir, and then Vladimir just kind of vomited out all the stuff that had happened over the past 12 to 24 hours. And at the end of telling Ivan the story, Vladimir asked him, "Would you please come with me to go find my dog?" And Ivan, he just stared at Vladimir and eventually just said, "No." And then, after a long, awkward silence, Ivan kind of backed up from Vladimir, like he didn't want to be near him. And then Ivan told Vladimir that Vladimir had been marked by the tiger, and now the only hope he had was getting as far as humanly possible away from this tiger, because that tiger is never going to stop, and it's going to eventually track you down and kill you. Vladimir felt totally let down, but he couldn't force Ivan to go with him, and so he said, "Okay, I understand." And then Vladimir left Ivan's cabin, he went back outside, and the instant he was back on the snow, one of his 2 dogs suddenly acted like they had heard something or seen something, and they took off running. Vladimir didn't have a chance to grab the dog's leash, and so he's watching as yet again one of his dogs is disappearing into the forest. Now, Vladimir did not chase after this second dog because he knew there was this Siberian tiger out there and he couldn't risk, running into it by himself. And so again, it totally pained him to watch his beloved dog vanish into danger, but he really couldn't do anything about it right then. And so instead, Vladimir spent the rest of this day going cabin to cabin all over this area, asking all his neighbors, please come with him to help him track down his dogs. But each of the people he spoke to just said no for the same reasons Ivan did. They said, "Vlad, you have been marked by the tiger. I'm not going out there with you." And so finally, as darkness began to fall, Vladimir and his 1 remaining dog just gave up trying to get help, and they turned around and began walking back towards their cabin. It was nearly pitch black by the time Vladimir and his dog arrived at the cabin, and when they got there, even though he could barely see anything, Vladimir knew something was terribly wrong. Vladimir's outdoor sink, which sat right outside of his cabin, was broken to pieces, like something had smashed it, and then also all of his beekeeping boxes had been broken apart, and there were obvious teeth marks all over it. Now, these 2 things had not happened when he had left that morning to try to go get help, which meant, very likely, the Siberian tiger had come back and done this damage, and very likely was still in the area. And so all Vladimir is thinking is, I have to get in my cabin as fast as possible and shut and lock that door. And so Vladimir grabbed his last dog, and very carefully he maneuvered his way through all the wreckage. He went up to his front door, and as he's about to open it up, he hears whimpering. And it sounds like one of his dogs who's gone missing, and the whimpering is coming from inside of his cabin. And so without any hesitation, Vladimir flung the door the rest of the way open, and he looked inside, and he couldn't see anything at first, but then he noticed there was this kind of pile of broken up furniture from the day before, and the whimpering appeared to be coming from underneath it. And so Vladimir rushed over and he began moving the furniture out of the way, and sure enough, underneath it, he finds one of his missing dogs who's been very badly hurt, but who is still alive and who is whimpering. And so Vladimir, he's so happy that one of his dogs is okay, and he grabs his dog. But, unfortunately for Vladimir, this was a trap. Now, we don't know this for sure, but the leading theory is this Siberian tiger actually set this trap on purpose to catch Vladimir. It's believed that this tiger wounded the dog so the dog would begin to whimper, luring Vladimir out, at which point the tiger could pounce. Four days later, that armed search party led by Yuri arrived at Vladimir's cabin. They found it destroyed with blood everywhere. They went inside. There was nothing there. They came back outside. And that's when Yuri's dog began running in circles and the crows flew into the air and they heard that deafening roar like the whole forest was roaring. Well, that was the sound of the Siberian tiger. Luckily, though, Yuri was not just some rugged outdoorsman. He was actually a member of something called the Inspection Tiger Unit, which basically is like a SWAT team that responds to tiger attacks. And so when Yuri heard this unbelievable roar, he just started walking straight towards it. But with every step Yuri and his team took into the forest, the roars coming from this tiger faded farther and farther away from them. But at the same time, Yuri began to notice on the ground little scraps of clothing. And so Yuri and his team, instead of trying to follow this roar, they just began following these bits of clothing. And these scraps eventually led them to a big clearing in the forest, and in this clearing were these two big red circles in the snow. And so Yuri and his men carefully approached these circles, and when they realized what was in them, they just stood there in silence. In the center of the left circle was a heap of Vladimir's clothing, and then underneath them were just bits and pieces of Vladimir, like he was ripped apart into different pieces and kind of piled up in this circle. And in the other circle, the right circle, was Vladimir's head, and it had been completely skinned. And after seeing this, Yuri and many other people have come to the conclusion that this Siberian tiger attacked Vladimir just for revenge. That this tiger felt like, Vladimir was encroaching on its territory, it stole its boar kill, and then also Vladimir had shot the tiger, wounding it, which only incited the tiger more, and so finally the tiger laid a trap and caught Vladimir and ripped him to pieces and then displayed him for the search party to find. Yuri and his team would eventually find and kill this Siberian tiger. But by this point, the tiger had actually managed to kill at least one other hunter, and very much in the same way it killed Vladimir, by luring this hunter into a trap, and then pouncing and killing, and ripping the hunter to pieces, and then displaying them, basically warning other hunters not to come in here. And while the death of this tiger certainly made Yuri and other people living in this area feel more safe, at the same time, Yuri has been told by other locals that unfortunately now, because of his brush with this tiger, he has been marked by the tiger, just like Vladimir. And so, according to legend, at some point, unless Yuri goes far, far away, he's going to be tracked down and killed by a tiger.
He trembles over broken windows through fields of set steel. Bright kites rise beyond the smokestacks, like signals learning how to feel. He trembles over through the skyline, above the silent factory maze, while rust conveyor belts awaken under fractured summer rays. Every rooftop hums in static through magnetic clouds of dust, and the old machines start turning like forgotten hearts of rust.
You showed up late in that red dress glow, dust on your heels and a kiss too slow. My name on your lips like a secret prayer. I tried to stay cool, but you knew I was there. Hey, you pull me close, then you slip away. One look from you
A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.